Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to another raid ranking video for Final Fantasy XIV. We've already covered A Realm Reborn and Heavensward as part of our 10th anniversary celebration for A Realm Reborn itself. So now we move on into 4.0 with the Omega raid series. Stormblood's raid series was pretty well enjoyed by most people. While I have certain gripes about the actual story elements of it, at least up until the final part, there are a lot of notable encounters throughout all of Stormblood's raid series, though some notable for the right reasons and some notable for the wrong reasons. It's worth remembering that this was the first full expansion after they kind of nailed the formula, the one that they used in Alexander the Creator, that would make things more accessible to people who weren't only hardcore raiders. As such, Deltascape started off very interestingly, but we'll get to cover that in a little bit. So strap on in, and after you watch the video, share your rankings, if you have them, for the Stormblood raid series in the comment section of the video below. All right, well, coming up at number 12, which in my list I wrote down as number 13. I guess I can't get coils off the mind. Number 12 is Deltascape's first encounter, Alt-Roit. I don't think this even needs explaining to anyone who was around for Stormblood. If anything, you would be surprised if it was anything else. Alt-Roit on Savage, our very first Savage raid encounter in Stormblood, barely even counts as a Savage encounter. It's almost completely identical to normal mode with a few small changes. The damage is higher, less AoE indicators, and there's no rails on the side of the arena. It was so easy that some groups beat it in a single pull, completely blind. That's how easy it was. If you did that nowadays, it would, I'm not saying it couldn't happen nowadays, but it would be just as harped on, I suppose. It would be considered unacceptable. And honestly, most of us felt that way back then. I actually didn't even have a static going into Deltascape. I party findered this fight, and my results weren't too different from that. I mean, it wasn't a one-shot, but it certainly was way faster than what you'd expect for the party finder on day one. Honestly, if this wasn't at the bottom, it would be a problem, but Alt-Roit, you're smack dab at number 12. Now, my number 11 is really on a personal note. I definitely am not taking in community and how everyone felt with this one. This is all me. My number 11 is Guardian, which is Sigmascape's third encounter. This one's probably going to surprise people because I know a lot of people who really liked Guardian, but me, I just think it was kind of slow and unfun. I even did it again recently before the Omega Protocol came out, and I was kind of hoping I would feel different. And that just really cemented it, if anything, at this number 11 spot. Now, foregoing the fact that it looks like it's really random, but there's actually only 2 rotations problem, whatever. That actually happens in a lot of encounters, so I'm not even using that against it. Regardless of which path you get, the fight just feels like it takes too long, like it's 2 minutes too long of an encounter. If the exact same fight were closer to 10 minutes, it was more compact, then I'd actually think it would probably stand at a much higher place here, because it is the pacing of those mechanics that really takes away from them being that interesting or engaging. Even then, I guess I don't think many of them are that noteworthy. Honestly, the funniest thing about this encounter, and the thing that I remember best, is the super slow missiles, because everyone saw those missiles like, why are they so slow? Who would ever get hit by them? Everyone's been hit by them at least once. It's just, it's so slow. You ever do like a really slow song in a rhythm game and it's way harder than the fast songs because it's just like you're waiting and waiting and waiting and it just kind of throws you off? That's kind of what happened here. And to me, that's the most notable thing. It's not the virus path or the monitor that changes the thing. It's the slow missiles. Honestly, the only other thing I really remember is the little bombs that need to be disarmed, but it's such a quick thing and they just kind of show up at a couple points in the fight and then they're gone. So they just have so little relevance that I can't really count them. I really wish I liked this fight more, but I don't, so that's why it's here. Next up, number 10 is Nook. One encounter before the Guardian at 06 would have been this fight, and it's another just simply boring encounter. It's just this boss floats in and out of paintings and requires players to use their duty action to both collect the paint colors and paint in specific things. I mean, it depends on which painting it is, but it already loses points for having a duty action. Just the clunkiness of that made any Stormblood raid or trial that used it, much less desirable to me. But the fight itself just also isn't very involved. It was often considered to be a striking dummy encounter because you just sit there and beat on the boss because almost all the mechanics happen wherever you're dealing damage. Maybe one of them's like a step off of melee range, or there's like a really close max melee range spot if you want to optimize, but honestly, just wasn't a whole lot going on. You know, I DPS'd this fight, and I kind of liked doing it on content because it was a striking dummy. I could just try to focus on trying to get as big a number as possible, and that had its own fun, but I was basically just like not engaged in the encounter, and it was like trying to have a perfect striking dummy run, which is not great when you're doing that every week, week after week after week for loot to get ready for the next ultimate. So definitely not a favorite. So number 10. Number 9 is the Phantom Train. I mean, almost all Sigmascape's out of the way, and honestly, this feels not wrong, but like I guess I could have put it a little higher. In theory, I love this fight. You know, the Phantom Train I think was a really off-the-wall choice for a boss encounter, and I love that they went with this as one of the bosses. The problem is that it's not a great fight overall outside of the spectacle of you fighting a train, which is kind of what the Phantom Train does in Final Fantasy VI, where it's pulling from in the first place. At the very least, it's a big step up over Alt-Roy, but it's basically 3 ghost mechanics on rotation, and then sometimes the boss does like proximity AoEs or knockbacks or both. And that's kind of the end of it for the entire encounter. The ad phase is not super interesting, and then it ranges from either mildly tedious to absolutely, well, tedious for one person. I was going to say absolutely, I guess not even a thing, because what we started doing very early on was sending like a red mage or a warrior to kill their ghost in like 4 or 5 GCDs, use all of their cooldowns to kill it, so the rest of the party didn't have to do one of the ghost mechanics during the ad phase. The problem is, now the other 7 people are lining up to do their burst, and that one person is completely screwed. And that was all it accomplished. I knew warriors who hated this encounter for that reason, but it was just like there was no in-between with this encounter. Not to mention, the biggest disappointment of it is the lack of suplexes. You can't put the train in the game if there's no suplexes. Okay, that's not an actual point off. That's not why it's number 9, but I had to bring it up. At least the normal mode has a fun little Easter egg for those of you who played Final Fantasy VI, but whether or not you'll ever see it in the normal mode, well, I don't know. I've never seen it, so I just know it's there. Number 8 is going to be Catastrophe, and this is the first part of the list where I actually struggled a bit to start ordering them. Catastrophe is going on number 8 mostly because of the duty action involvement, which I felt just dragged down almost any fight that it was actually in. You know, I look at this fight, and outside of the duty action being clunky, oh man, it's so unfortunate because I actually think this is one of their more clever encounters. I mean, there's a lot of placement related stuff and a lot of stuff that we never see in any other encounter that's, I guess some of it dependent on the duty action, but some of it just specific to this fight. And it's rare that we have a fight that actually has mechanics that feel like they've never shown up again or didn't show up before. Like it's just weird to have that kind of involvement in the first place. So the big thing is using these AoEs as radars to locate tremors that were under the ground, and then splitting into floating and non-floating stat groups and having floating people affected by some AoEs different than others. It was really cool to play a fight on a Z axis. And I've always been afraid of that. They did it a little bit in 1.0, specifically with the very final encounter, Riven Road, and it was kind of weird there. But this is a much more modern take on it, and it works really cool, but it's just so clunky because of the duty action. So I almost feel sorry about this fight's placement because I honestly think Catastrophe deserves better. Moving on to number 7 with Midgard Sormer. This one I think is going to very heavily depend on what role you ask. I actually really like this fight, which I guess is a hot take thrown in the other video I put out a couple weeks ago. It combines Nidhogg, Hraesvelgr, and the original dungeon Midgard Sormer with some new mechanics thrown in. I think the stress on the tanks with the random flying versus ground mechanic was a bit ahead of its time design-wise. So in Stormblood, if you got selected as the main tank over and over again, we didn't really have great tools of dealing with that, so it became really stressful on the tank and potentially on the healers to deal with the tank busters if you were just not allowed to swap. But with Shadowbringers and Endwalker, tank tools were far more fitted for that kind of design, so I just don't want to knock it for that. It was just kind of out of place for when it was added to the game. The ad phase is a little bit underwhelming, but I do like the debuff carrying from the ad phase into the first mechanic of the final phase, and the frequent dodges and stacks and spreads, and of course, the boss actually doing the spins, the vertical spins versus the horizontal spins, even if we did eventually figure out a kind of pattern to it, so we could just determine if it would be one or two things at any given point in the fight. It never really took away from it. It didn't add as much as I would have liked either, but again, that's why this is kind of like a number 7. I do think that if you ask tanks who tanked it at the time, they will rate it way lower than 7, but you know, that's a role specific thing. I'm just thinking it's a higher quality fight than some of the other stuff that we saw in Stormblood. Now, number 6 is going to be Kefka and God Kefka. So I really struggled to decide whether I wanted to split up door bosses and their final boss forms for Deltascape, Sigmascape, and Alphascape. In Stormblood, we were introduced to the concept of a true door boss. While Heavensward did have the Fausts, this had like full bosses with mechanics and checkpoints, and it was way more of a thing than what we saw in the previous expansion. So I thought maybe rate them differently, but no, I'm going to package them all together and judge them based on how I feel about both encounters, because essentially that's what I had to do every week. I didn't just get to choose to do one or the other, or one and then the other and get loot for both. No, they're all kind of a package deal. Honestly, so first off, I wasn't a huge fan of them using Kefka. They created really superficial reasons to use old Final Fantasy bosses and these iconic bosses in these tiers. And to me, it's like the least creative way to do it compared to stuff like the Crystal Tower and a bunch of the other references we've seen throughout the game. This was really ham-fisted. On top of that, they made a cardinal mistake in normal mode of only including 3/4 of Dancing Mad. And I don't normally use normal mode to judge this kind of stuff, but that's harsh. As like a long-time Final Fantasy fan, you can't just cut parts of Dancing Mad out of the entire thing, even if it's a completely logical reason why you're doing it with the Savage exclusive phase. So that's something. But in terms of the actual fight, there's a lot of things I just didn't find fun, and I think some of that's because I did it mostly as a DPS. Like the fake out AoEs and the brief memorization mechanics, I think they work well. The high auto attack damage, something that Neo X-Death in the previous tier didn't have at all, definitely made it more engaging for tanks and healers as well, which I think is a huge plus. Boss positioning being a thing again, frequent healing checks, sometimes too frequently given the time, were all a mix of, you know, mid to positive effects. But unfortunately, I just think the fight overall was kind of on the boring side. Very visually appealing. I love the music in Savage especially. And there are a lot of positives, but I think that they don't make for a great experience equally across the roles. And I think as a DPS, it was just way, way too boring. It also does this Stormblood thing of repeating the last mechanic over again. And for some fights, it's maybe 2 or 3 minutes like this one. Some of them, it's like half the fight repeating itself. And I'm going to criticize all the Stormblood fights that do that. And, you know, that on top of the other things I didn't like about this, just nets it kind of in the middle here. There's just other fights I like better. Number 5 is going to be Chaos. Now, in stark contrast to the other two first encounters, and that of Altroy and Phantom Train in Deltascape and Sigmascape, Chaos as a first fight in Alphascape, I feel sets the prime example for a well-balanced first fight experience, even to this day. The mechanics for the first and second half of the fight are actually completely identical, but every pull the order is random, so you either get 2 mechanics in the first phase and then the other 2 mechanics in the second phase, or it reverses, so you can basically prepare for the entire fight and learn the entire fight in the first 50%, and then it becomes a purely execution-based check. Now, there are other aspects to those individually that may determine positioning, but all the same, I feel like that works really, really well. And something that almost to me feels more like it would be better placed as the first expansion, as the first raid tier of an expansion. But it worked really well here, especially after having the previous, 2 fights. You can also identify the pattern really easily because there are attacks other than the major mechanics that let you kind of know once you know how to do some pattern recognition. But a lot of the mechanics are also really free form. Like the game wants you to achieve a certain thing, but we did see a decent variety in strategies. We saw people coming up with better strategies week after week. And that was especially true with the ad phase, where it just gives you a slew of debuffs and 1 ad to kill. And you just know how to disarm those things. So we saw people coming up with positioning for melee uptime, caster uptime, full uptime for everybody, all sorts of different things. And I think that's the sign of a good encounter, when you're not forced to only do things a single way, and you can continually learn and improve, because it lets the players who are looking for that sort of experience get a little bit more mileage out of the encounter. And to get that out of a first fight of a tier, I mean, it's just a great way to start every week. And it's also a great thing to have once, the raids have been out for a while and you want to teach people stuff. I just think it's a great first fight, and I hope you all get to experience it at some point or another synced. Now, number 4 is going to be Omega MNF and Final Omega. While Kefka and God Kefka made me have to ponder if I should separate them, this one was more difficult because I have wildly different feelings about Omega MNF and Final Omega, and they would be in very different places individually in this. Omega MNF would be closer to this number 4 spot, and Final Omega probably would have gone back a few spots. So how did it get to number 4? Honestly, Omega MNF carry it to this spot. The first phase against MNF, in my opinion, fantastic boss. It has some of those repeating elements in Stormblood that I don't like, but it's really fast paced. There's a ton of raid damage. And while the mechanics repeat, honestly, you're just so focused on doing them right and the movement of the bosses and making sure that one is slightly further out and that the party's in the right spot and that there's looking around. There's environmental stuff with the eye moving around and needing to keep track of that. And the way people interpret it, there's a lot of things to say about that first phase that keep it engaging despite having some of those Stormblood isms. A lot of spreading and stacking and doing everything very quickly and identifying the spots. And you know what? When you look at top and you look at how Omega MNF was done, you kind of see how we got that more true random-esque feel from the top mechanics. As well, I wouldn't call Omega MNF mechanics true random necessarily. There is a lot of that kind of everyone's just like moving out to a spot and moving back in, and then it just kind of mixes that up a little bit for top. It's pretty easy to see where they got the inspiration for some of that stuff. Now, moving on to Final Omega, there's individual elements I really like about it. Patch, which destroyed groups despite just being a tether mechanic. Let's be honest, it destroyed them because it was a tether mechanic. Hello World, awesome. The tank buster mechanics, really engaging, very surprising. And also this visceral feel with that boom laser. Every time it hits, the bass in it is just so satisfying. The problem is that everything other than those 3 things are really not too impressive. Not to mention the fact that after Hello World 2, which is probably the pinnacle of the fight just repeats itself in the second half. Yeah, it's got the enrage sequence where he just does a bunch of raid damage. It's become a lot more standard nowadays, but it's way less impressive than MNF are, in my opinion. But that being said, the transition's super cool. The overall quality of the fight is quite high. The music is top tier. The atmosphere is top tier. So it's got a lot going for it. It definitely deserves this number 4 spot, even when I combine both MNF and Final Omega. Number 3 is going to be Helix Nasus. Some people would rank this as number 1, and quite frankly, I wouldn't blame them. This is one of our best third fights in a tier ever, even to this day. And it's just, this transcends the previous encounters in terms of the ranking between 3 and 4 so much. It's right up there with the Phoenix encounter and Final Coils and some of the other ones, but it has it all. It is a mix of fast and frantic mechanics, constant position and DPS checks, and lots of little reactionary movements based on what the boss is doing. The entire final phase gives you an arena with a bunch of different panels, and the boss can jump to any of them and do a mechanic from it. And depending on where the boss lands, what panel it's on, it just changes what you have to do. The last phase is really dynamic and fun, and that is something we just don't see every day. The tank buster hits hard as heck. Some of the mechanics are really fast. Again, there's so much variety in the early phases and the ads and the little DPS checks you have to do. It shows it's a masterclass on raid fight design. I don't know why they can't replicate it. Like, I actually think some people harp on some third tier fights too much. I actually love Phoenix from Pandemonium, which we'll eventually have to do a video on. But this is like the primest of examples. It's very similar to how I feel about Chaos for first encounters, and it's crazy to see that we got these all the way back in Stormblood. The only thing that was a disappointment here is that the desert from normal mode was missing. And we all theorized what would happen. What if we were like going through it and like there were antlions and we had to time going through this, the little desert trap thing. And, you know, that was cool. It's still, and it was also a really nice reference to the game this is from, Final Fantasy V. That being said, I'm not knocking points off for that for real. Everything the fight delivers, I think, is fantastic in its own right. Now, that description tells you why that could be some people's number one. But for me, I got to go off fights that I enjoyed and how I enjoyed them the most. And for me, I enjoyed two encounters more. Number two on my list is Omega from O11S. In a similar vein to the third fight of Helix Nasus, O11S was another great example of a third fight. And against the Beetlebot, it's high on my list for a different reason. Helix Nasus was high on my list for it being excellent all around. This is up there for how thematically sound and fun it is combined. Omega as an encounter breaks some of those Stormblood traditions of repeating the same mechanic over and over while still technically doing it. Basically, Omega being a learning and adapting machine who's trying to improve and get stronger, when he hits you with a mechanic and learns that it didn't work because you survived and did it correctly, the next time that he does it, he does like a souped up version. He changes something about it. He evolves something about it. And the fact that that continues throughout the entire encounter, all the way through to the final Pantocrator before he just does a few more things and then enrages, it's just, it works so well. And on top of that, all of the individual mechanics are all very threatening, very engaging, and not very cheesable. There's like one thing with the giant fists that was kind of really cheesable because we figured out that you could identify who would be targeted by them and when every single time as soon as you entered the instance and did the mechanic for the first time. But that's just like a weird like server programming thing that just like, I don't know, it just made it happen that way, the way it selects the targets. But it's another one of those like, oh, look, they can do third tier fights. And it's just, it makes me so mad when I see stuff like P7S and E7S. And then we get stuff like this and we get stuff like Helix Nasus. And honestly, even Guardian, I don't like it, but there are a lot of decent qualities about it that it just comes down to my personal like feelings about it. I don't know, maybe one day we'll get more good third fights, but Stormblood, you treated us really well, and I appreciate it. And finally, that leaves my number one, which is D4S, O4S, whatever you'd like to call it, X-Death and Neo X-Death. This probably isn't that much a surprise if you watched my top 5 raid fight video of all time, but it's just, this fight to this day gets me amped. X-Death is, I think, hands down the best door boss we've ever had, and is the style of door boss I wish they would do more often. They completely abandoned this type of door boss after X-Death, and I think they were wildly successful at it, so I don't get it. It's like a 4-minute-ish non-stop DPS check with tank and heal mechanics that push everything to the edge. It's tight on execution, tight on scaling, and is followed by one of my favorite transitions to a final boss in the entire game, in that of Neo X-Death. Now, on top of that, Neo X-Death is one of the better truly stationary bosses. And you know what? I say truly stationary, he's not, and that's kind of what makes him better. While he as a boss cannot be moved or positioned by the party, his mechanics teleport him all around the outside of the arena and forces the players to constantly readjust as to where he is and do mechanics based on where he teleports. So again, I feel like when they do stationary bosses and they just leave them north the whole time, that's when they fail, and Neo X-Death just isn't one of them. There's very few cases of ones that work. Sephiroth from my trial video, but again, very few that actually work. Now, I will say this, Neo X-Death does have some weaknesses as an encounter overall. His lack of tank autos makes mitigation a bit of a snooze fest. Healers also only really have one major mechanic to deal with. And you know what? I think healers are okay with telling you how much they put into Almagest or Almagest, however it's pronounced, but even still, And then on top of that, he does the thing where he repeats the mechanics in the second half of the fight. But all the mechanics are fun and involved, a little tiny bit random, so it's never too much of a slog. Honestly, I just hope they one day do the short door boss and the long final boss again. And no, DSR does not count. I mean, in a Savage encounter, the 4-minute and 12-minute encounter versus the, what is it, like 7.5 minute and 8 minutes, or like 8.5 and 8, I don't know. It's just like 2 equal length encounters that I just have to double up on, which I just haven't been as big a fan on as stuff like X-Death and Neo X-Death. And that's going to be a wrap for my Stormblood raid rank series. So difficult to say. Let me know again what your thoughts are in the comment section of the video below. If you were around for Stormblood and you have personal rankings, throw them down there. I'm really interested to see who throws things like Guardian further up and how many people end up throwing Helix Nasus at number 1. I'm willing to bet that it's more than 1. I'll say that at least. Anyway, thanks for watching. Be sure to keep an eye out for more of these ranking style videos for Final Fantasy XIV. And with that, I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, take care.